I held the birthday card up to the kitchen light, the way you do when you're trying to read something written in pencil. My wife had set it on the counter without a word, just pointed at it and walked away. She does that sometimes. Finds something and lets me figure it out on my own. The envelope was addressed in my son's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a voice on the phone before they say their name. 5 years of silence, and now this. A birthday card, arriving 3 days after my birthday had already come and gone. I should have just opened it, but something made me stop. The handwriting on the outside was his. I was certain of that. The way he always pressed too hard with the pen, leaving slight grooves in the paper. The way his capital letters leaned just slightly to the right. I'd watched him learn to write at the kitchen table in our old house in Dayton, Ohio, back when he was 7 years old and couldn't sit still for more than 4 minutes at a stretch. But the return address in the upper left corner, that I didn't recognize. It wasn't his street. It wasn't anywhere near the apartment in Columbus he'd been renting when we last spoke. The zip code was different. Everything was different. My wife came back into the kitchen and found me still standing there, holding the envelope like it might tell me something if I just waited long enough. "You haven't opened it yet," she said. "Look at the return address," I said. She leaned in. "Read it," looked up at me. "That's not where he lives," she said. "No," I said. "It's not. I need to back up. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand what the 5 years were actually like. My son's name is Nathan. He'll be 34 this September. I have watched that kid grow from a scrawny, gap-toothed boy who was afraid of thunderstorms into a man I barely recognize. And I mean that in every sense of the phrase. He was always sensitive. That's not a criticism. I say it the way you describe the color of someone's eyes. Just a fact. He felt things deeply, took things personally, remembered every slight and every failure longer than anyone around him did. My wife always said he got that from me. I don't know if she meant it as a compliment. When he was 26, he met a woman named Cassandra at a work conference in Cincinnati. She was from the West Coast originally, Portland, Oregon, and she had this way of talking about Nathan's family, about me and his mother, that I noticed the very first time they came to dinner. Little comments, subtle things. The way she'd look at him when I told a story from his childhood, like she was filing it away somewhere. "Your dad really likes being the center of attention, doesn't he?" she said to him once, and she said it right in front of me, smiling like it was a joke we were all in on. I let it go. You do at first. You tell yourself it's just a personality difference, a generational thing, a matter of getting used to each other. Within a year of them moving in together, Nathan stopped calling as often. Within 2 years, the visits had dried up almost completely. There was always a reason. Work was busy, Cassandra had something planned, they were tired, they were saving money for a trip. The reasons were always perfectly reasonable. That was the thing. You couldn't argue with any one of them individually. It was only when you lined them all up that the shape of it became visible. The last real conversation I had with my son was at Thanksgiving 5 years ago. We argued. I'm not going to pretend I handled it well, because I didn't. I said some things about Cassandra that I shouldn't have said at a dinner table with other people present. He left before dessert, and Cassandra was already in the car by the time he stood up from his chair. He sent me a text that night. It said, "I need some space. Please don't contact us for a while." I gave him space. I gave him more space than I ever thought I was capable of giving anyone. I sent cards at Christmas and on his birthday, never knowing if they arrived, never getting a response. I called twice, once 6 months in, once on his 30th birthday, and both times it went to voicemail. I did not leave a message the second time. I didn't know what to say that I hadn't already said. My wife handled it differently than I did. She's always been better at sitting with uncertainty. She'd say things like, "He knows where we are," and she meant it as comfort, But there were nights I'd find her at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a cup of tea that had gone cold, just sitting there, and I knew what she was thinking about. You don't stop being a parent just because the door gets closed on you. That's the thing nobody tells you. The worry doesn't stop. The love doesn't stop. You just have nowhere to put it anymore. So when the envelope appeared on my kitchen counter, with Nathan's handwriting on the front and a return address I didn't recognize, I understood why my hands weren't entirely steady when I finally slid my thumb under the flap. It was a birthday card, simple, from a drugstore by the look of it. One of those cards with a photograph of a mountain lake on the front and "Thinking of you" printed in silver letters. Inside, in his handwriting, it said, "Dad, I hope you had a good birthday. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Maybe we could talk soon." Nathan, that was it. No explanation. No apology. No mention of the 5 years. I read it 4 times standing at the counter. Then I sat down. My wife read it over my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. I turned the envelope over again and looked at the return address. A street in Bend, Oregon. Not Portland, where Cassandra's family was from, but close enough to that side of the country. I got out my phone and looked it up on the map. A residential neighborhood. Nothing unusual. "Maybe they moved," my wife said. "Maybe," I said, but I kept looking at the handwriting on the outside of the envelope. The way it pressed into the paper. The lean of the capital letters. And then I looked at the handwriting inside the card. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. The handwriting on the outside of the envelope. His, definitely his. But the handwriting inside the card. The N in Nathan at the bottom. The way it was signed. I'd seen that signature before, and it wasn't on anything Nathan had ever written. I have a box in the hall closet, the one on the top shelf that my wife calls my paper graveyard. Old documents, old letters, cards going back decades. I've always held on to paper. My wife thinks it's a quirk. I think someday it'll matter. And that day came sooner than I expected. I climbed up on the step stool and pulled the box down and set it on the kitchen table and started going through it while my wife watched from the doorway. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Give me a minute," I said. I found it about halfway down. A card Nathan and Cassandra had sent us for our anniversary, maybe 6 years ago, back when things were still civil. It was the only card I had with both their handwriting in it. Nathan had written the message, and Cassandra had signed her name at the bottom. I set it on the table next to the birthday card. My wife came over and looked at both of them for a long time without speaking. The signature at the bottom of the birthday card, Nathan, was written in Cassandra's handwriting. I would have bet my life on it. The way she wrote her lowercase a, fully closed, almost like a printed letter. The slight leftward hook at the end of each word. The pressure of the pen, lighter than his, almost delicate. Nathan hadn't signed that card. Cassandra had signed it for him. "Why would she do that?" my wife said quietly. I didn't answer right away because I was already thinking about the return address. A street in Bend, Oregon that neither of us had ever heard of. Not Nathan's address, someone else's, or a made-up one. And this was the thought that started sitting heavy in my chest, an address that would come back to us if we tried to respond. "She wanted me to write back," I said. My wife looked at me. "She sent this," I said. "Not Nathan. She wrote the message, signed his name, put an address on the front, probably one she has access to somehow, and she wanted to see if I'd reach out. To him, or to her, or to whoever is at that address." "But why?" my wife said. "What does she want?" That was the question I didn't have an answer to yet. I didn't do what my instincts told me to do, which was to call the phone number I still had for Nathan and demand an explanation. That's my nature. I've always led with the front of my head instead of the back. My wife has spent 40 years gently suggesting that I try it the other way around sometimes. Instead, I waited 3 days. I thought about it while I was drinking my morning coffee. I thought about it on my walks around the neighborhood. I thought about it at night, lying in bed with my wife asleep beside me and the ceiling doing nothing useful. On the third day, I called Nathan's number. It rang twice and went to voicemail. A generic automated message, no name, no greeting. I didn't leave a message. Then I did something I'd resisted doing for 5 years. I looked up Cassandra online. I don't love social media and I don't use it much, but I know how it works well enough. I found her without too much trouble. Her accounts were mostly private, but the profile picture was visible. Her smiling somewhere outdoors, trees in the background. Recent by the look of her hair, which she'd cut shorter than I remembered. I looked at her listed location. It said Portland, Oregon. Not Bend. Portland. So the return address on the envelope wasn't hers. I sat with that for a while. Then I called my younger brother, Stuart. He's retired now, spent 30 years as an insurance investigator, and he has a way of thinking about deception that I've always found useful, if occasionally unsettling. I explained the whole thing to him over the phone. The card, the handwriting, the return address, the online profile. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. The address in Bend, he said. Have you tried looking it up, seeing who's registered there? I had not. Stuart walks me through it. There are property records that are public in Oregon. It took about 20 minutes of looking before we found the name associated with that address. It wasn't Nathan. It wasn't Cassandra. It was a man named Victor Marsh. No relation to anyone I'd ever heard of. Could be a friend of hers, Stuart said. Could be a family member. Could be a business contact. Could be a lot of things, I said. The question, Stuart said, is what she was hoping you'd do. You write back to that address. What happens? Does Victor Marsh forward it to her? You write back to that address. What happens? Does Victor Marsh forward it to her? Does he open it? Is there something you might have written that she could use? I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. What I haven't told you yet is the financial piece, because it's embarrassing, and I'm only telling it now because it became relevant. About 2 years after Nathan and Cassandra got together, he called me out of the blue and asked if I could help them with a loan. They were trying to buy a house, he said, and they'd run into some issues with the down payment. He asked for $18,000. I had it. We'd been careful with money our whole lives. My wife and I. We didn't take vacations we couldn't afford. We drove our cars until the wheels were ready to fall off. We put money away every month because we'd both grown up watching what happened to people who didn't. 18,000 was not nothing, but it was something we could do without devastation. I lent it to him. We drew up a simple repayment agreement, the kind you can find templates for online. He signed it. I kept a copy. They never bought a house. When I asked about it a year later, Nathan said the deal had fallen through and they were still renting. When I asked about the money, he said they'd talk about a repayment schedule soon. When I asked again, 6 months after that, the conversation went badly and ended with him telling me I was treating him like a debtor instead of a son. That was about 6 months before Thanksgiving, before the argument, before the 5 years of silence. I still have the signed agreement in my paper graveyard box. I talked to a family attorney, not to threaten anything, just to understand where I stood. She was a woman about my daughter-in-law's age, sharp and direct, and she listened to the whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "So you have a signed loan agreement, no repayment, 5 years of no contact, and now what appears to be a forged, or at minimum, an unauthorized card." "That's about right," I said. "The loan agreement is still enforceable," she said, "especially if you have it in writing and it's signed. That doesn't expire just because the relationship has been difficult." "I'm not interested in suing my son," I said. "I understand that," she said, "but what you might be interested in is understanding why someone would want you to make contact with an address they control, because that's a very specific thing to want." She suggested I do nothing for the moment. Send nothing to the Bend address. Make no calls. Give it 30 days and see what happened. If she wanted you to reach out, the attorney said, and you don't, she'll probably make another move. People who want something don't give up after one try. She was right about that. 16 days later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Oregon area code. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man who said his name was Victor, the same name associated with the Bend address, and he said he was a friend of Cassandra's and that she'd asked him to call on her behalf. He said she was worried about Nathan. He said Nathan had been going through a very hard time and that the situation between all of us had been weighing on him. He said Cassandra thought it would be good if I could send something, a letter, anything, that she could share with Nathan to show him that I still cared. She just wants to help him heal, Victor said on the voicemail. She thought if he saw something in your handwriting, something sincere, it might help him take a step forward. I listened to that message standing in my driveway in the late afternoon light, and I felt the particular coldness that comes when something you suspected turns out to be exactly what you thought it was. She wanted something in my handwriting, addressed to that property, something she could use. For what, I still wasn't entirely certain, but I thought about the loan agreement in my box. I thought about what a document in my handwriting, addressed to her controlled address, might look like in the context of a legal dispute. I thought about acknowledgements of debt, or the opposite, something that could be characterized as a settlement, or a waiver, or a relinquishment. I am not a lawyer, but I've lived 67 years and I know when someone is trying to get me to put something in writing. I called Nathan's number again the next morning. This time it rang 5 times before voicemail. Different from before. I left a message. I kept it simple. I said, "Nathan, it's Dad. I got a card recently that came from a return address in Bend, and I've also gotten a phone call from someone named Victor. If you sent that card yourself, I'm glad, and I'd love to talk to you. If you didn't, I think you should know that someone is doing things in your name. Either way, I love you. I'm here. Call me when you're ready." I hung up and went inside and told my wife what I'd done. She nodded slowly. "What do you think he'll do?" "I don't know," I said. And that was the truth. He called back 11 days later. A Sunday afternoon. I was in the backyard, pulling weeds out of the garden bed my wife keeps along the fence, and my phone buzzed in my shirt pocket, and when I saw his name on the screen, I sat down right there on the ground between the tomato plants. "Dad," he said. "Nathan," I said. There was a long pause, the kind that carries a lot of weight. "I didn't send that card," he said. "I didn't know anything about it until I got your voicemail." I let out a breath I'd been holding in some ways for 5 years. "She's been trying to figure out your finances," he said. "She thought," he stopped, started again. "She thought if she could get something from you, in writing, acknowledging the loan as a gift instead of a loan, she could use it. We've been having some financial problems, some serious ones. She thought she could make it work somehow." "Nathan," I said. "I know," he said. "I know. How long have you known about this?" I asked. Another pause. "I found out about the card about a week before your voicemail," he said. "I told her she had to stop. That's when I knew I had to call you. We talked for a long time after that. Not about the money, not about Cassandra, not about what happens next. We talked the way we used to talk when he was in high school and would come find me in the garage on Saturday mornings, supposedly to help me fix something, mostly just to talk. I sat on the ground between the tomato plants until the sun had moved and my wife had come to the back door twice to check on me. That was 7 months ago. Nathan is no longer with Cassandra. That happened on his timeline, in his way, and it was not something I pushed. when you made the mistakes I made, saying the wrong things at the wrong table at the wrong moment. You learned to leave certain doors for other people to open. He drove out to see us in Dayton in the spring, the first visit in 5 years. He looked older, the way that people who've been under sustained pressure tend to age in a concentrated way. But he sat at our kitchen table and ate the dinner my wife made and told us about his life, the real version of it. And I sat across from him and tried to just listen. I have the loan agreement still. I don't know what I'll do with it. My attorney says it's still valid. Nathan knows it exists. We haven't talked about it, and I don't feel any urgency to talk about it. Some things can wait. The birthday card is still in my paper graveyard box. I kept it not out of bitterness, but because it's the thing that started all of this. The object that made me look closer. That made me sit down on the kitchen floor with a box of old documents and remember that I raised a boy who presses hard with his pen and whose capital letters lean to the right. I know my son's handwriting. I have known it since he was 7 years old. That's the thing nobody can fake. I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently. That's what you do when you get to my age, and something like this lands in your lap. You turn it over and over, looking for the moment where a different choice might have changed the shape of everything that followed. But here's what I keep coming back to. I didn't lose 5 years because I was a bad father. I lost them because I trusted that love alone would be enough to hold a door open, and I didn't pay close enough attention to who else had their hand on the knob. That's on me. Not entirely, but enough. When Cassandra first came into Nathan's life, I saw the signs. The little comments. The way she repositioned herself in every room she walked into. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing for too long. And then I said too much at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong people. I swung from one mistake straight into another, and Nathan got caught in the middle of both of them. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, the kind that costs you something, is that paying attention is not the same as acting on what you see. I paid attention. I just didn't know what to do with what I was seeing, so I either sat on it or I blew it up. There was no middle ground, and middle ground was exactly what the situation called for. Cassandra sending that forged card, using Nathan's handwriting on the outside and her own on the inside, trying to get me to put something in writing that she could use that didn't come out of nowhere. That was the behavior of someone who had been operating without consequences for a long time. She'd learned that she could manipulate the people around her, and no one would call it what it was. I'm not excusing it, but I understand the conditions that allowed it to grow. Nathan knew, somewhere underneath everything, that something wasn't right. He told me as much when we finally talked. He said he'd been uneasy for a long time, but didn't have language for it. That's what isolation does. It takes away your vocabulary. It cuts you off from the people who knew you before, and without them, you start to lose track of what's true. The thing that saved us, and I believe it saved us, was that I didn't react from anger when I figured out what Cassandra had done. Every instinct I have told me to pick up that phone and say exactly what I thought. I've done that before, and I know where it leads. Instead, I waited. I called my brother. I talked to an attorney. I sent Nathan one careful, honest voicemail, and then I let it sit. That restraint didn't come naturally to me. I practiced it the way you practice anything hard. Badly at first, then less badly, then well enough to matter when it counted. Nathan drove out to see us in the spring. He sat at our kitchen table and looked older than he should, and I looked at him and thought, this is what it costs to learn something the hard way. Both of us paid it. We're both on the other side of it now, figuring out how to rebuild something that got damaged through a combination of his choices and mine and hers. I still have that birthday card in my closet. I kept it because it's the object that made me slow down and look carefully instead of just reacting. A card with his handwriting on the outside and her handwriting on the inside. 2 different people, pretending to be one. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop, Hold something up to the light and ask yourself, does this actually look right? Not does it look the way I want it to look? Does it look right? That question, asked 5 seconds before I would have just torn the envelope open, that question gave me my son back.